All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's live session on future-proofing procurement. My name is Joe Adamski. I'm a senior director with Procurability, a procurement services firm dedicated to all things procurement and supply chain. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Kelly Barner, co-founder of The Art of Procurement. Kelly, thanks for being here.
Absolutely, Joe. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to everybody who showed up live to watch us, or maybe who's catching this later on demand.
Wonderful. So let's jump right into it. Today, we're tackling how nearshoring, onshoring, and resilient supplier ecosystems can future-proof procurement. We'll start with the big picture. Why are companies thinking about shifting their strategies now? What's driving this trend?
I mean, obviously, the easy answer to that question is tariffs, right? And there's been a lot of discussion around how that's been driving company decisions about where they source and the logistics that they manage. But this is a much bigger picture thing. It took a long time to set up, and it's going to take quite a while to unwind it to the extent that we can. One data point I just want to throw out, this surprised me when I found it. So back in the 1960s, 95% of clothing consumed and worn in the United States was also made in the United States. So I know we're going all the way back to the 60s, but if you think about that 85-year swing, it took us all that time to go from 90% of clothes made here all the way up to nearly nothing, right? And so now, as we've had industries go overseas to lower cost countries, and as everybody starts to look to come back, certainly costs are going to drive it, but there's geopolitical concerns. There are consumer delay concerns that we wouldn't necessarily have thought about decades ago. So there's a lot of other factors above and beyond tariffs that are actually driving some of these decisions now to attempt to do any of the X-shoring, right? Nearshoring, reshoring, friendshoring, any of those.
Yeah, and it's interesting on the apparel, it's actually the US number now is less than 3%.
Which is, truthfully, I'm shocked it's that high, right? Because the vast majority of garment, you pick them up, you look at it, it is usually not made here.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lot of the stuff that's China and Vietnam are the two primary countries it comes from, but also everywhere else in Southeast Asia you can look at, Bangladesh, Burma,
Yes.
Thailand, getting it from there as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's break down the pros and cons of nearshoring versus onshoring. Where should teams think about it? How should teams think about it? Where should they start?
So figuring out what is possible, right? So what can you do relatively short term? And I think there's a couple of things to think about around that, depending on what it is you're looking to reshore. If it's a process-oriented thing, then you're looking for a certain kind of capacity, a certain kind of skill that can manage the process. A lot of these supply chains, though, go back to raw materials that are not possible to reshore because they were never here in the first place. And so looking at what are the components and materials that go into the good or the component or the material that you're looking to source, figuring out if there's already capacity here in the United States, here in North America, depending on your scope, and looking at the time frame over which you're looking to make a change. Is this something that for risk reasons you feel like you need to bring back very quickly as a high priority issue? Or is this something that's a longer term strategy that's actually part of corporate restructuring and new strategies to start making your supply chain and therefore your revenue stream a little bit less dependent on the rest of the world? So figuring out why you're looking to reshore and where you have second or third tier dependencies that may or may not actually make a move back closer to home, either practical or effective.
So how should companies think about balancing the costs of nearshoring and reshoring with the risk and the need for transparency through the whole process?
Yeah, that's a great question. To me, these two things, the risk and the transparency, they very much go hand in hand. You can't understand what your risk is if you don't have transparency into your supply chain. And so that involves not just knowing who your tier one suppliers are, but knowing who their tier one suppliers are, and so on and so forth, right? Figuring out how quickly does your supply chain leave the country? How quickly does it leave the continent? Getting that general understanding first. So really going through a detailed supply chain mapping exercise is critical. But I also don't think any of this is like a one size fits all, fix all of it with one strategy. So, for instance, split shoring is another one of those trendy terms that has come up, where you say, okay, maybe we can bring some of our capacity back, maybe we can meet some of our demand locally, but maybe some of it for the sake of overall cost or for the sake of pursuing multiple strategies in tandem. We might bring some of it back, but we might leave some of it where it currently is. And fortunately, figuring out the cost implications, the timing implications, and the risk implications of all of that is something that procurement's fundamental skill set is perfectly suited to do. And so I would say looking at all of the options on the table, not looking at an all or nothing approach, and considering every single viable option is going to be the best way to sort of manage your company through what could otherwise be a big trend that sort of burns itself out quickly.
Yeah. Let's talk about real world wins. Do you have any standout cases?
So, when I think about reshoring, there are a couple of examples that come to mind. To me, TSMC is sort of like the number one example everybody talks about. We're worried about access to semiconductor chips, and whether that's literally anything you buy as a consumer or whether it has to do with demand for the different forms of AI. I think we've all become hyper aware over the last few years about concern there. And so, through the Chips and Science Act, we started to get federal funding involved. And through that, we have now in the US Southwest factories, fabs being built so that we can start creating not just the general chips that go into so many things, but even some of the cutting edge things as you get up to higher and higher nanometer count, right? So you want more sophisticated processing capability on a smaller and smaller chip. But there are some lesser known examples as well. And one of the ones that I recently came across is actually a partnership between Corning. A lot of people might be aware of them as glass manufacturing. There might even be some Corning ware in your kitchen cabinets. But they've become part of a partnership to start both sourcing the materials for and also producing polysilicon based solar panels here in the United States. Now, part of why I like this example is that, well, first of all, it has nothing to do with tariffs. It's nice to get a break from that theme. But it's responding to something that would have to become a total global shift. So, until a couple of years ago, the vast majority of solar panels not only came from China, but they came from Xinjiang province. And if that doesn't sound familiar, what might is a community called the Uyghurs. So it's a ethnically Turkish group of Muslim minority people that live in China. They're largely concentrated in the Xinjiang province. And there's been enough concern about forced labor and general living conditions in that region that the United States, a couple of years ago, passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, UFLPA. And what it does, this is actually really unique as far as supply chain adjacent legislation. It says whitelist. So we're going to assume that absolutely anything at all coming from Xinjiang involves forced labor, unless you can prove all the way back through your supply chain that it does not. And what that caused to happen is not just sort of a screeching halt in terms of the availability of solar panels coming to the United States. It actually caused, through enforcement, massive shipments of panels that had made it here to be sent back because it was very simply on the books. Customs is not going to let these solar panels come in. And so rather than through funding, as we see with Chips and Science, we're seeing through legislation, no, you can no longer source these in a part of the world where the capabilities and the materials are highly specialized and optimized. We've got to find a better way. And so it took a few years, but now we have, through Corning and these other partners, I know a lot of it's focused in Michigan, but there's some other states in the Midwest that are involved in it as well. To me, that's a great example of something that we wouldn't necessarily think about in this reshoring trend, but we're seeing innovative US-based companies step up, and everything from manufacturing through material sourcing are planning to focus in the United States. It's early days, so we'll have to watch and see. We'll have to see the cost implications of doing all that work here. But I take it as a positive sign that it is possible to move things back to the United States when the will is there to make it possible.
Yeah, but I think when we're seeing that, if we look at the data, look at employment in manufacturing as a portion of the
Yep.
overall workforce, I mean, it's been declining on a percentage basis
Yep.
for 50 plus years. We look at it from a pure numbers perspective. It bottomed out around 2008 and has actually been climbing since.
Yep.
So that's reflective of some of it. But if you look at it from the types of factories that are being built, the technologies that are coming in, they're highly automated factories. We
Yeah.
have robots doing the work that previously would have had many people on a production line. So the style that's coming back when we do reshore things, it does end up looking very different than what the traditional assembly line factory is. It's not the 1950s model at all.
No, it's definitely not. And I agree with you about the automation piece, right? People have in their minds, like, okay, what does manufacturing look like? Something from like a Charles Dickens bootblack factory might come to mind. That is not what manufacturing is like anymore, right? Especially in the United States. But we do have a lot of automation we can bring to bear. Think about even those little, I forget what they call them, the little robots in sort of the Amazon factories that can zip around and pick
Mhm.
up orders and move pallets. That's one way to look at it. But I do think there's another piece to this story. It's something we've seen a lot of buzz around for the last 2 years, especially. Unionized labor has become very vocal. So we saw the UPS renegotiation with the Teamsters, United Auto Workers' willingness to strike, East Coast longshoremen willingness to strike. So there is a organized labor component to this. And no, those three unions that I specifically mentioned aren't necessarily going into manufacturing and looking to fill these factories. But it does suggest to me that there is still a segment of the US population that wants to do that type of work, that is willing to be organized about it. And I think if people like the heads of these unions that we've heard so much from over the last few years are looking to grow their reach, grow their territory, grow their membership, some of these manufacturing reshoring opportunities open the door to them sort of expanding their addressable market and bringing additional people in. So I do think automation is going to play a huge role in it, but I think there's a labor story to be had as well, especially when it comes to supervisors and operators and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think very true. And I think switching gears slightly to like the nearshoring side of the coin, that's definitely something I've seen has been, I won't take it all the way back to tariffs, but it's certainly been a response to
Yeah.
the global trade system that was set up under NAFTA and then its successor of USMCA. I look at Mexico and see they were, a net recipient of a lot of investment for things
Yeah.
like that. There's been, where 20, 30 years ago, we didn't necessarily think about them as a heavily industrialized country, but a lot of that has moved in. There's a lot of
Mhm.
automotive production that's there, and that's come from Europe and from China as they've moved factories to be closer to the US market. A lot of things beyond that, that it's just been a surprising amount of investment that's gone there in order to be able to take advantage of the tax regime that's been in place.
Absolutely. And to your point about this extending back over years, there are a lot of different factors putting pressure on this. And I think what we're seeing now is them all kind of coalesce around companies taking it more seriously. I mean, in the days, there's a word anybody wants to talk about less than tariffs. It's probably COVID. So we might as well hit both of them. In the year or so after COVID hit, everybody was going to reshore everything, right? And
Mhm.
how much of that happened? Uh, Pretty close to zero. Like, I'm going to say less than the number of garments that are made in the United States was actually reshored. But I think
Mhm.
what we've seen since then is that the feelings about the concern of getting goods all the way from Asia to the United States remained. But then you add to that consumer expectations for shorter lead times, producers' desire to be more responsive to consumer demand. We've seen the Red Sea basically shut down as a shipping channel. And so you've
Mhm.
got between geopolitics, economics, transportation, you've seen all of these things start to come together. And now it's sort of like, pick your reason. So you can't necessarily reshore everything, and you can't necessarily do it fast or cheap. But where it makes the most difference to your company, to your revenue streams, and to your customers, you can find a way to do it. And I think there's also been enough time for some of the manufacturing capacity or even warehousing capacity to start to adjust to that level of interest. So I think it's been a long time in coming. It's going to take a long time to change, but I definitely think we're starting to see less knee-jerk reaction to this idea of nearshoring and more legitimate strategy put in place that involves a longer-term plan.
Yeah, I've always described supply chain strategy as balancing efficiency with resiliency. And
Yeah.
we had heavily over-indexed on efficiency, probably still are over-indexed on efficiency.
Yeah.
The upset from COVID and then everything that's happened in the 5 years since has, I don't want to call them black swans anymore at this point, because there's just a whole flock of them that have been coming.
Yeah.
But those have continued to demonstrate that, and it's going to continue to be an issue. But so, speaking of resiliency, resilient supplier ecosystems.
Mm.
What's your playbook?
So here's what I love about this question. It's not new, and it's one of the things that procurement does really, really well. When you think about this idea of a supplier ecosystem, to me, this goes back to the core of really what procurement has learned over the last 10 to 15 years, right? So, not going all the way back to the 1960s, but the early days of sort of formal procurement, strategic sourcing, we got all enthusiastic about supplier rationalization, right? We sort of combined everything down to doing most of our business with fewer, larger suppliers. Then those contracts came back up for renegotiation, and we all realized, uh-oh, first of all, we no longer have leverage, and we've sort of driven all of our options out of the market. And so I think it's been swinging back, and whether it's through deliberately diversifying, which is similar to this idea of split shoring, or deliberately working with small, localized, specialist diversity on suppliers, right? Bringing them into it as a way of working with different companies so that we're not quite as reliant on a few suppliers. I think, to me, I mean, if you think about procurement playbook, that is one of those core table stakes things that we probably haven't thought about a ton as a strategic approach, but which now, if we're talking about it in the right way, can be incredibly valued to people elsewhere in the company, especially decision makers, to say, hey, let's look deliberately at what percentage of the business we award to these different suppliers. We can help evaluate incumbents. We can help evaluate direct competitors. We can also go out and find really creative new ways to meet an existing business need. And then we can run the optimization strategy to figure out the right mix in the final contracts. So this is sort of like a new way or a refreshed way of applying something that procurement has been awesome at for a really long time. And I think one of the upsides to that is that in a time where there's been so much change and so much variability, to be able to fall back on something that's such a fundamentally proven skill for procurement, I think there's a sense of strength that comes from that, and will probably give teams more confidence when they actually go out to make these recommendations to the business, to put proposals in front of suppliers for part of the volume, or to just simply be involved in those active negotiations.
Very true. Interesting thought. For the audience, we do encourage questions. If there's something as we're talking that you want to see us discuss, please, by all means, go ahead and throw it into the chat. So if we think about transitioning of strategies, what are going to be the biggest hurdles or the biggest challenges that companies will face?
I mean, we don't necessarily want to talk about it all the time, but cost is a reality, right? Anytime you're changing something, you're going to have to deal with the cost of that. But I think the other thing that I would bring into it is time. And so even if we think about a very typical strategic sourcing project where you're moving the majority of volume from an incumbent supplier to a new provider, this is another one of those areas where we can look at what procurement does really, really well and use that experience to talk the rest of the company through something that's related. So whether it's moving where production happens, moving where sourcing happens, or simply changing from one supplier to another, it's looking at, okay, we know that there's going to be a different cost structure. How do we split the volume? We know that there's going to be a ramping up time. So there's going to be a ramping down time for either a departing incumbent or an incumbent whose volume is contracting. But you have to be realistic about bringing in that new supplier. Expect the bumps in the road. Make sure there's open dialogue. Make sure that there's a plan for handling surprises, because those are inevitable. And so I think it can take a little bit of confidence for business decision makers to say, okay, we're going to move away from an incumbent, or we're going to test somebody new. Procurement would like to say to them, it's going to be fine. Don't worry about it. Everything's going to be great. Listen, everything is not going to be great. You have to be realistic and expect things to go wrong, because that way everyone is calibrated and doesn't panic when the first thing comes through that they hadn't anticipated. So lots of
Mhm.
communication, lots of project management, lots of oversight, and I think maybe staying involved beyond the point in the process where procurement would typically have an active role. I think those are all opportunities to, as I said, take what we've proven we can do really well and just extend it into different business strategies.
Right. And I do think it's always the flip side of that when you talk about cost, but it's also balancing that with the benefits and
Absolutely.
being able to clearly articulate that. And with all the various stakeholders and the concerns and issues they have, it's the old Witham
Yes,
concept. What's in it for me?
exactly.
Mhm. So we've
Yeah.
got a question that came in. So for companies transitioning, what strategies will help to ensure transparency and mitigate risks like some of the knowledge gaps or contractual disputes that might occur?
And I know I'm asking you to clarify something, Joe, that's come in from the audience, but I'm going to assume that we mean transitioning from overseas to either the U.S. or nearshore, perhaps in Mexico, if that's what we're talking about. Um,
That's the direction I
okay.
would take it. That is transitioning from an offshore to a nearshore or onshore
Sure.
strategy.
So the big thing, obviously, transparency is access to data, understanding of differences in timing. But for me, that's where I want to go back and look at my specs and make sure that absolutely nothing is left to the imagination. This is especially important in cases where you have done long distance or low cost country sourcing for a long time. And there have been some assumptions baked in to what's being done, processes that are being handled. What you don't want to have is maybe a longtime supplier that has figured out over time, because they're good at serving your needs, that you've asked for this, but what you actually need is this plus a little bit, or this adjusted in some way. Making sure it's absolutely clear on paper, making sure that there's testing, making sure that there's overlap, right? This isn't a switch that you're flipping off and then a switch that you're flipping back on. I think, having lots of contingencies in place so that sales don't get disrupted, but going back to the fundamentals, make sure the details are right, make sure they're right in writing, and make sure everybody is talking about changes as you see them.
Absolutely. So we've had a follow-on question asking about visibility into the HTS system by country. For those who aren't familiar with what HTS is, if we can go deep into acronym soup, that's the Harmonized Tariff Schedule. It is a numeric code that has been assigned by commodity to make it easy to be able to track what is being imported and exported on a standardized basis, so that all countries are using the same thing as international standard. As far as getting visibility to it, this is something that's very important as we move into the future with the tariff regime that we're seeing. Particularly if you just focus on the US, if you look at goods under the USMCA, it doesn't cover USMCA trade pact does not cover every single item that is transitioning across the Canadian and Mexican borders. So there are still trade aspects that are not covered by it, and that are required to pay duties and tariffs on them. And so this needs to be very clearly articulated in all of the customs paperwork, what exactly is there. There are tools that can help with this, and being able to manage your brokerage properly in order to make sure that you're not
Mhm.
overpaying on various aspects of your trade program. It's very critical. A small mistake on this can have huge consequences, because you could end up overpaying by 10 to 50% on a given commodity if it has the wrong code that's assigned to it. So being able to drive that, it's like everything else, it ends up being an investment in the right IT tools to be able to manage that. But it will take time for the system to be able to work itself out. And as we get more attention on this, problems with it will certainly surface and solutions will start to present
And
themselves.
if I could just add to that really quick, Joe, I think it's important to keep in mind that, right now we're in this 90-day window, right, where things are sort of shaking out. We're figuring out where they're going to land longer term. Making sure that
Mhm.
you're crafting a strategy that matches the expected duration of the disruption is really important. So if this is going to be a short to medium term disruption, craft a short to medium term strategy that you can put in place quickly and can be adjusted for the future. I would be really careful about overly locking in on strategies that, frankly, in 6 months might no longer be relevant. So just making sure that Despite how loud the media shouts and how upset the news gets, staying professional and making sure that sort of the cure fits the illness, both in terms of cost flexibility and the time required to roll it out. Those are probably good like checks and balances to discuss internally.
Yeah, these are long-term solutions. And so we need to understand, what is that long-term
Exactly.
landscape going to look like when you start building out some of those scenario analyses for that. All right, so final question that I have, and we'll certainly take more from the audience if there's any, but what is the first thing that our viewers should do tomorrow?
Okay, here's where my recommendation starts. First thing, breathe. Right? All the oxygen has been sucked out of the room by the news headlines and the press conferences and statements out of the White House. It is so easy to get swept up in the furor of the coverage. So that is always my first advice, actually, in all situations, supply chain procurement and otherwise. Step one is breathe, right? To me, then, step two, what do we know is procurement? Go back to the data. Make sure that what is being discussed applies to you, right? So you might hear something about a company in a news headline that seems concerning. And what you need to do is figure out, well, are we buying from that location? Are we buying from that business unit? So go back to the data and dig into the details. And then the other thing I would say is focus on what can be done. This is an actual opportunity for any of us that worked in this
Mhm.
space through COVID to apply what we learned back then. We've all got some battle scars. And so I think it's an opportunity to show a little bit of the strength that we developed during that time. There are always going to be things you can't control. There are always going to be unexpected things happening. Back to your flock of black swans, Joe. But making sure that anything that can be done is qualified and put in front of the business as an option with risks and benefits. And focusing on the steps that we can take, making calculated decisions about when it's best to wait. I would just say staying calm, being data driven versus emotional. Definitely don't be reactionary. But making sure that you're staying on top of all of this and figuring out which pieces actually apply to your company, your suppliers, and your supply chain.
Absolutely. I think we've got an interesting question that came in about the concern around the availability of
Mhm.
skilled labor. So, and specifically highlighting India as an option. I think it's always fair to raise that as an objection. Um, Having an educated workforce, having a skilled workforce is certainly necessary. But I think that's one of the things people would argue from an onshore perspective, that you generally can count on. You may not always have all of the support industries that are necessary for what you're trying to do, but the people are certainly there. But I would think the success we talked about earlier with Mexico shows that it is something that can be solved, but it has to be part of the calculus. When you're looking to locate your factory somewhere, yes, you need to make sure that there's going to be an availability of skilled
Mhm.
labor to be able to do it. And that's why you start to see clusters of industries form, because they will sit in one location because they've recognized that you've got that. And so you have now people in that area that are bringing the right
Yep.
skills, you are bringing the right educational talent to that area, and it becomes a self-reinforcing virtuous cycle to make sure that you have that available. It's going to a completely new area where maybe there is not any industry, there may not even be infrastructure. That's where you have that greater risk. There may be reward
Mhm.
to it because there could be an underserved available pool that's there, but that is something that has to be balanced when you're developing your
Yeah.
strategy.
Specific to India, and I'm actually fortunate here. I've had the opportunity to interview a couple of times. Samir Kapadia, he's actually the number one trade lobbyist between the U.S. and India. You're spot on with the comment about infrastructure, Joe. That's actually equal to, if not more, of a concern necessarily than skilled labor when you're looking at India. But the upside that a lot of people don't necessarily expect, and this goes back to why are you looking to change where your source? If you're concerned about geopolitical risk, one of the huge things about India is that they don't typically accept outside investment into their companies and operations, which means, unlike a lot of the other countries in Southeast Asia, where if you're looking to do sort of a China plus one strategy and you might look at Vietnam or Cambodia, you could end up in a country where actually it's still a Chinese run operation. So you think you've diversified, but you haven't. India is one of the places where you're actually stepping away from a Chinese invested in, Chinese run, Chinese owned operation. So if moving away from China for the sake of risk is one of your key business drivers, I would definitely say that, especially for long-term response, India is a good place to look, with those caveats that you do, of course, need the trained labor, and you want to make sure the infrastructure is there to move goods around and get them in and out of the country efficiently.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, I see we're coming up on the end of our time. So I want to thank the audience for your attention today. A lot of good topics that we've discussed. There's a lot more that's out there. There's a QR code that popped up on the screen that you can subscribe to the market insights that Procurability produces. There's a separate report that we're producing on a weekly basis specifically devoted to tariffs that would come as well. Highly encourage you to sign up for that and get it delivered to your mailbox on a weekly basis. So Kelly, thank you very much for your time
Absolutely.
today.
Thank you for having me.
Really appreciate it. It's been a great conversation. Thank you. And thank you everyone out in the audience.